Sugar in the Blood, A Family Story of Slavery and Empire by Andrea Stuart. Narrated by Reneé Pitts. Copyright 2012 by Andrea Stuart. This unabridged audiobook is recorded by arrangement with Alfred A. Knopf, an imprint of the Knopf Doubleday Publishing Group, a division of Random House Incorporated, and was produced in the year 2013 by Tantor Media Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. The past is not dead. In fact, it's not even past. William Faulkner. Preface. My family is just one of millions across the globe that were forged by sugar and slavery, and so my chronicle has echoes across the Americas as far away as Australia and the Indian Ocean. Virtually all our stories began the same way. Some English or European migrant abandoned the old world for the new, eventually to become enriched by the production of sugar, which became known as white gold. During this process, their bloodlines inevitably became intermingled with that of the slaves imported to farm and service this new economy. Yet, despite the ubiquity of this tale, I could not recollect a non-fiction book that tried to tell it. One which explored how the epic forces of sugar, slavery, and settlement made and shaped the life experiences of our ancestors and our world today. So, I have written that book myself. The narrative of the book is organized around the particular genealogy of the Ashby family, my maternal ancestors. It begins with my first identifiable ancestor and continues to the present day. This approach caused me some heartache, since it has meant focusing the initial section of the story largely around its white progenitors, whose experience is definitively documented. That doesn't feel comfortable, but it allows a more representative story to be told, since the Caribbean was a European world in the early years of settlement, with blacks in the minority for several decades. And this methodology also demonstrates a fundamental truth about the region's families, which overwhelmingly started as ethnically white and over time became predominantly black. So, historical veracity triumphed, but that has meant that my African ancestors do not enter the picture until they are confirmed on the family tree. The unknowability of their past is one of the many terrible byproducts of slavery, when people, reduced to chattels, are written out of history and deprived of a personal past. Ghosts haunt this tale, small men whose lives leave only very faint footprints, and slaves whose sufferings leave no mark at all. My debt of honor has been to try to reconstruct their stories, black and white, and bring them to vivid life, using the scraps and fragments of information available to me. In doing so, I have been very aware of the tensions between helping stories to be told without abusing the limitations of historical record, and allowing myself to interpret and comment while acknowledging the silences of the undocumented past. Andrea Stuart, February 2012. Introduction. In every conceivable manner, the family is link to our past, bridge to our future. Alex Haley. I happened upon the name of my earliest known ancestor while sitting in a brutally air-conditioned library at the Barbados Museum, poring over a 17th century census. There he was, George Ashby, my maternal grandfather 8 times removed. I knew how unusual it was for family research to reach back that far, and I felt utterly exhilarated. My stomach lurched and my eyes filled with tears. This sense of elation lingered for a long time, and my previously vague interest in genealogy suddenly sharpened. I decided to find out more. The journey that followed wasn't always joyful. There were unpleasant shocks as well as happy surprises, perhaps the most painful being the discovery of one of my ancestors on a slave return, a register of slaves held on an individual plantation. Just another commodity, listed like pigs and cows and farm machinery. My sorrow and fury were tempered only by my gratitude that I had found him, as if somehow he could draw comfort, as I did, from having his life noticed and honored by a free descendant. Eventually, I built up an unbroken family tree reaching back to 1620. I was initially triumphant, but as time went on, a sense of anticlimax overwhelmed me. What did my neatly formatted family tree really mean? It was, after all, just names on a page. Genealogical research has its limitations. It yields the skeleton, not the body. But between the bones I had, nonetheless, glimpsed something intriguing, a story of migration, settlement, survival, slavery, and the making of the Atlantic world. I realized that there was a book here, struggling to emerge. I continued investigating, but now focusing on secondary sources that brought to life the context and detail of the period. Over time, my maternal line began to gain both shape and color. I followed George Ashby from 17th century England, where he, alongside thousands of others, turned his back on his homeland and migrated to the Caribbean island of Barbados in search of a new life. I tracked the lives of his descendants as they became enmeshed in the sugar industry and the Atlantic slave system, and I followed the offspring of those descendants, myself included, as they migrated back to the cold winters of England, the U.S., and Canada. Although this book is not about me, the story is of course my own. It forced me to revisit my own Caribbean childhood, the holidays spent at the family plantation, Plum Grove, where we could look out of the bedroom windows and watch the fields of waving sugarcane being harvested by other, poorer Barbadians. At the time, I had no idea how privileged this life was. That understanding came later, after I had grown up and made my home in England and had come to see that the cane fields in which I played had once been drenched in exploitation, grief, and death. And I had recognized something else, that my family story is at once very specific, very particular, but also wholly typical and representative. It is a story that belongs not just to me, but to many, many others. My family, like the families of those others, is the product of sugar and of its siblings, settlement and slavery. This book is the story of how those forces shape the minutiae of the Ashby family's intimate relationships, and how, in turn, those family relationships rippled outwards, transforming the societies in which they lived. It is, then, more than a family history. It is a global story, too, one that fixes its gaze on the connections between continents, between black and white, men and women, the free and the enslaved, demonstrating that the individual is not just a victim of global history, but an author of it as well. Part 1. The Pioneer. Chapter 1. There was a wind over England, and it blew. Have you heard the news of Virginia? A west wind blowing, the wind of a western star, to gather men's lives like pollen and cast them forth, blowing in hedge and highway and seaport town, whirling dead leaf and living, but always blowing. A salt wind, a sea wind, a wind from the world's end, from the coasts that have new wild names, from the huge unknown. Stephen Vincent Benet, Western Star. George Ashby's story began as all migrant stories do, with a journey. Sometime in the late 1630s, when George Ashby was finally given notification that his ship was ready to sail, he must have been afraid. He was a blacksmith, a young man in his late teens, about to leave behind everything he had ever known. Though the voyage carried the seeds of his dreams, he, like most of the population, had probably never undergone a long sea journey before, and had no real idea of what to expect when he arrived in the Americas. Those who chose to undertake the fearsome Atlantic crossing in search of a new life were generally tough, or else dangerously foolish. But what else can we know about George Ashby, my great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather? Was he fleeing from a family, or seeking a new one? Did he dream of religious freedom or of wealth? Was he ambivalent about leaving his homeland, or were his life experiences so bitter that he believed nothing in the Americas could be worse? As he set sail for the adventuresome world of the Caribbean, he would have had no idea how heavily the odds were stacked against him. According to one historian, men like him were pursuing a will-o'-the-wisp, since very few of them ever achieved the better life they longed for. He could not know that he would be one of the lucky ones, that he would not just survive, but found a dynasty that endures to this day, built on sugar and forged by slavery. The first sight of the ship would have done nothing to allay his trepidation. The typical merchant vessel that plied the route between the Caribbean and Britain was rated at around 200 tons, meaning that it could accommodate 200 casks or tons of wine. Trussed against the stone walls of the dock, the ship looked like a gigantic gutted carcass afloat upon the water. The gaunt ribs of the wooden hull curved menacingly into the sky, and the base was coated with a shaggy pelt of seaweed and barnacles. It would have been hard for George to countenance that he would be confined in the belly of this behemoth for almost 2 months, with the real possibility that his journey would end, like that of so many before him, in massacre by pirates or drowning at sea. After unpacking and settling in, the passengers were summoned on deck to present their documents to the searchers. These officials administered the oath of allegiance to the king, stamped each traveler's ticket with the crucial licenses under their hands and seals to pass the seas, and then cleared the vessel for departure. Since every passenger had to undergo this process, no matter what their individual circumstances or where they came from, it represented their first rite of passage, one that made their new status as migrants starkly real. Still gathered on the bridge, the passengers chatted among themselves or waved to family and friends gathered portside to wish them bon voyage. Then, all of a sudden, a flurry of activity, the sailors scrambling across the deck, busying themselves with a series of tasks that were inexplicable to most of the passengers, the screeching of the anchor as it was winched aboard, the screaming of the hoisted sails, the shouting of the master and the sailors, all combined in a violent auditory assault. As the crew worked furiously in the bows, stern, and dock, the passengers jostled to be as near the rails as possible. Despite the noise and bustle of the ship, most of the migrants would have been as hushed as worshippers in a church, fearful of what the voyage might hold, or trying to imagine what lay at the other end. They were aware that the journey was, in all probability, final. Some may have dreamt of returning to their homeland, enriched, perhaps even ennobled, but most rightly sensed that they would not be coming back. To truly grasp what this sea journey meant, what bravery and audacity it required, one must understand how the world was seen and known at that time. Though George Ashby and his contemporaries had been born in the age of discovery, 1500 to 1700, most of the world was still terra incognita for Europeans. Maps were often sketchy and inaccurate. 2 continents, Australia and Antarctica, had not been traced at all, and vast areas were still blank. The interiors of South America, Africa, and Asia had scarcely been explored. Beyond the eastern fringe of North America, which George's fellow pioneers had begun to document, were millions of square miles of uncharted wilderness. Like many other countries in the Old World, England was poised between the medieval and the modern, where most people's lives played out within a narrow radius around their birthplace, and their beliefs were characterized by superstition and ignorance. It was an age in which magic still played a large part in the lives of ordinary people, and many firmly believed in witches and fairies, that butterflies were the souls of the dearly departed, and that churchyards swarmed with souls and spirits. In the absence of real information about far-off lands, fantasies abounded, that the East was populated with dog-headed men and basilisks, that Africa had tribes with no heads at all, just eyes and mouths in their breasts, and that the Caribbean was peopled by cannibals, Amazons, and giants. Some believed that the oceans were full of strange creatures such as mermaids and sea dragons. In 1583, Sir Henry Gilbert professed to have encountered a lion-like sea monster on his return from claiming St. John's, Newfoundland, for England. In a world that was as yet so immeasurable, frightening, and inexplicable, George and his fellow travelers must have feared that they were not just crossing the map, but falling off the edge of it. Yet by the 17th century, many thousands of Britons, beguiled by the much-vaunted possibilities of the New World, which they saw as a tabula rasa on which they could write, despite the long history and complex cultures long implanted there, were willing to take that leap into the unknown, and left their homeland to start a fresh life in the Americas. The migration had begun as a trickle in 1607, with the settling of Jamestown, the first permanent colony in what is now the United States. It had increased to a recognizable stream by 1629 and became a veritable flood in the 1640s, when over 100,000 people left a country with a population of just under 5 million. Between 1600 and 1700, over 700,000 people emigrated from England, about 17% of the English population in 1600. At the rate of 1 ship departing from England every day, these pioneers arrived to settle the Americas, fanning out from Newfoundland for 3,000 miles via Virginia and the Caribbean to Guyana on the South American mainland. All the way they fought, worked, and died to establish themselves in new and terrifying lands. The English weren't the only nation on the move. The Spanish were the pioneers of colonization of the Americas, and the Portuguese, French, and Dutch swiftly became essential players in the region. But just over a century after Christopher Columbus's discovery of the New World, which the historian Germán Arciniegas described as being so momentous a development in human history that it was like the passing from the 3rd to the 4th day in the 1st chapter of Genesis, it was the small nation of England that emerged as Europe's greatest colonizing power. This was particularly surprising for a people who were wedded to their native soil like a snail to his shell. What motivated these patriotic and insular people to abandon the world as they knew it and move halfway across the globe? The why of George Ashby's departure is something I will never know. My great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather was most likely typical of the men who settled much of the New World, a man of action, not reflection, who did not take time out to write letters or keep journals. Nor was he important enough for others to write about him. But certainly some of the wider reasons that stirred migrants to risk the New World would have applied to him. Historians have summarized Europe's motivation for the conquest of the Americas with the pithy phrase, God, gold, and glory. This formula is slightly reductive and certainly doesn't allow for the large number of migrants who had no say in their transfer, but it does convey the positive pull of the opportunities represented by the New World. It was not only the much persecuted Puritans who went to settle New England for whom God was important. The vast majority of those who migrated to colonies south of Maryland were what the historian Carl Breidenbach has dubbed non-separating Puritans. They may not have moved together as a religious community led by a minister, but they did share the Puritans' profound unease with the old ways of worship and were questioning of the ancient ceremonial doctrines of the established church. They, too, had looked on at the risible spectacle of the typical Sunday service in England, where parishioners stared dumbly at a minister mumbling incomprehensible phrases from the Book of Common Prayer, and recognized how far most people were from a true engagement with the Word of God. So while they had not been impassioned enough to make their faith the prime motivation for their migration, their religious leanings meant that they were that bit more likely to be disillusioned, and therefore to contemplate migration, than their fellow Englishmen. The Bible was, in fact, a potent recruiter for colonization. In an age where the scriptures permeated everyday life, there were numerous passages that would have resonated with those tempted by the Western Star. Great orators such as the Anglican priest Robert Gray, or John Donne, the Dean of St. Paul's, or the Puritan preachers Thomas Hooker and John Cotton thundered from Genesis, "Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee, and I will make of thee a great nation." Or from 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 10, "I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and will plant them, that they may dwell in a place of their own, and move no more, neither shall the children of wickedness afflict them any more, as before time." The dream of building a city on the hill for the perfection of the human spirit, so inspirational to the Puritans, was also an attractive one for many other migrants, as was the entire project of spreading the word. Captain John Smith, the era's most famous adventurer turned planter, declared, "If he have any grain of faith or zeal in religion, what can he do less hurtful to any or more agreeable to God than to seek to convert those poor savages to know Christ and humanity, whose labors with discretion will triple requite thy charge and pain? What so truly suits with honor and honesty as the discovering things unknown, erecting towns, peopling countries, informing the ignorant, reforming things unjust, teaching virtue and gain to our native mother country, a kingdom to attend her?" But rhetoric about taking Christianity and civilization to the heathen, so lavishly exploited by the Spanish conquistadors, or giving European creativity and imagination space to grow, was a smokescreen for the economic imperatives that drove the majority of migrants. They hungered for gold, or at least the chance to acquire land, their own little piece of paradise. Most 17th century English emigres were in flight from terrible poverty. In the late 16th and early 17th centuries, rapid population growth and periodic agricultural depression, culminating in a series of terrible famines, caused genuine hardship. In the countryside, large numbers of people had been deprived of their ancient rural security. The lack of land to cultivate frustrated many, while unemployment threatened agricultural laborers as well as village artisans. The rise in the cost of living and the simultaneous fall in the value of wages meant that many people were surviving on the very margins of existence. Housing was inadequate at best. In cold or wet weather, fuel was scarce and expensive. Health scares were frequent, with regular outbreaks of tuberculosis and plague. Effective medical treatment was almost non-existent, and so the mortality rate, already high, rose even higher. Resentment against these conditions focused and crystallized on a lavish, self-indulgent monarch, Charles I. His resistance to parliamentary challenge meant that, from 1629, the people had been governed by arbitrary monarchical rule. His decision to levy various taxes to obtain revenue, and his exploitation of press gangs who forced unwilling souls into the Navy, meant greater financial strain for his already beleaguered subjects and generated a real sense of bitterness. Thus was the king's coffers filled with oppression, concluded one pamphlet in 1649. His popularity was eroded further by his religious affiliations. Not only had he displayed a preference for the high Anglican worship that would so alienate the Puritans and others of that ilk, he had also married a Catholic queen, Henrietta Maria, and allowed her to observe her faith publicly. The wider political situation also contributed to the depressed mood of the country and the general suffering endured during this period. The 30 Years' War, 1618 through 48, which had seen warring Protestant and Catholic forces reduce much of Europe to a corpse-strewn battleground, further depleted the nation and contributed to profound collective dissatisfaction with the status quo. The decades from the 1630s through to the end of the 1650s were, according to the historian Peter Bowden, probably amongst the most terrible years through which the country had ever passed. He goes on, "It is probably no coincidence that the first real beginnings of the colonization of America dated from this period. Facing poverty, hunger, and actual starvation at home, the populace were more than usually attentive to the peddlers of tales told in taverns of the lands across the sea, where everyone could have a full belly and their own property." One such economic migrant was Richard Ligon, a cultured, educated gentleman of above 60 years, who had served at Charles I's court. He sailed for Barbados in 1647. Ligon was untypical of most migrants to the Caribbean by virtue of his age and class, but his reasons for migrating, essentially economic, would have resonated with most of his contemporaries. Though in the last scene of my life he had lost, by a barbarous riot, all I had gotten by the painful travels and cares of my youth, and left destitute of a subsistence. In this desperate condition, he looked about for friends to support him, found none, and therefore considered himself a stranger in my own country. As a result, he resolved to lay on the first opportunity that might convey me to any other part of the world, how far distant soever, rather than abide here. But the impetus towards the West was also a romantic one. Though the 1600s was still primarily a listening age, England, by virtue of its high literacy rates, over half the males in London could read by 1640, had a great many subjects who were able to disseminate the seductive mythology of the New World. This story, which had been evolving ever since Columbus, was a dream of Shangri-La, a completely inviolate and untouched world. In Richard Eden's A Treatise of the New India, 1553, one of the first books about the Americas, the author writes about the new lands, beautiful and rich, where there was much gold and a mountain whose sands sparkled with pearls and other such riches. He also talks of strange new peoples, some antagonistic, some friendly, all essentially rude and barbarous, beastly and fierce. This frightening yet bewitching fiction was heightened in the 16th century by the widely read tales of Spanish conquistadors.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?